going to have to list specific ones, but you would have a general idea. If I threw out a barrier, you could give me a solution to that barrier. Not necessarily the exact one, but it could get you thinking like, if time's a barrier, here's something I could do. If expense is a barrier, here's an idea to keep it from being expensive, right? A practical spin on those ideas. But the main thing is to be aware that these are things that might be barriers that you will encounter when you're working with parents. So that's going to be the important one. If you turn back just a teeny weeny bit, let's see the page number. I want to make sure I say the right page. On page 239, where it talks about the non-judgmental attitude, that idea is going to be really important. If I ask any questions about parental involvement, you're going to want to make sure that your answer is non-judgmental. You don't want to say things about, for parents who don't care about their kids, I would do this. Right? You know that, right? This morning you don't say that. The ideas that come from this are the ideas of valuing all families. So as the text suggested, you don't use phrases like broken homes, right? Because their home is not broken, it is their home. That is the way their home is, right? That you would not use the term single parent family as a negative thing, or a working mother as a negative thing. I got a little annoyed with the chapter the way it said, well, some mothers just have to work, and it sort of implied that unless you absolutely had to, moms wouldn't have any need to work or want to work. And some moms like working and want to work because it's fulfilling for them, and that's totally okay. So that was just a little, maybe I was just reading it in a too sensitive of a manner. But one of the things I want you to be aware of is that you are going to have to be open to all families. I'm sure you've talked about it in your diversity class. But the idea that whatever is your personal belief system about gay parents, you can say all you want, I don't believe in gay people being married or gay people having children. It doesn't matter if you believe in it, it exists. And you will have children in your class who have same-sex parents. And you will have to accept them as parents in your classroom, whatever your personal feelings might be. Maybe you don't think interracial couples should be married. Too bad. You will have interracial couples who are parents in your classroom, and they will be treated the same way everybody else is treated, with respect. So you have to get over whatever is your personal thing you think parents shouldn't be, whatever it is, don't care. You're going to work with that parent just the way you work with every other parent. That doesn't mean you're not entitled to your personal beliefs, but they can only go to you personally, not to anybody else. So I'm sure Dr. Durham Barnes has done a much better job of explaining those things, and if I contradicted anything she said, she's right and I'm wrong, because she's the expert. Think about things. If you value all families, you think about things that maybe you didn't know you had to think about. For example, for my babies, when we do the family tree project, in our family, that's not very sensitive, because we just have a branch for birth mama, and we are proud to put her on there. And we paste her with love and admiration. And we point to that branch on the tree and say, that's for my birth mama. She wanted me to have a family who loved me. Yay for her, right? But some people don't want to have that. And bringing up a family tree maybe brings up a father who's not in the home, or a situation that the parent is uncomfortable about in their family, or the child maybe feels like their family tree is different from the other person's family tree. That doesn't mean you can't have family tree. I'm glad my daughters had a family tree assignment. But you have to be aware that one of the things that my child's teacher did was they sent home a prepackaged family tree with the blanks for mother, father. So, and I remember thinking to myself, like when I saw the tree and it was all pre-filled out, I'm like, there's no birth mother blank. We're going to have to write her in. Scooch over, right? And then I thought to myself, but what if there's only a mother and a mother in your family? Then you're just told that that's so weird, there's not even a tree for that. I got to white it out to make my tree, right? Is that really how we want the kid to feel? But then because the teacher was fabulous, when I opened up the little packet explaining it, it said, this tree is for you to trace and make your own tree. In case you don't know how, you can make it however you want, but if you feel artistically challenged, this is a tree for you to trace. Because the teacher got the packet that came and said, oh, no, right? That's just for tracing. That's not your official tree. So I thought, well, that's a good compromise, because she didn't want to just throw away all those perfectly good trees for tracing, even though they weren't perfectly good for the assignment that we were doing. So you got to think about things like that. The one that is hard for our family that has happened is when they want kids to bring in a baby picture, because that's just not something we have. We don't have baby pictures. And it's really hard, especially for my Bella, to see the cute baby pictures because she wants to participate. And for her, because she's 8, taking in a picture of her when she's 2.5 is not a baby picture. That's not a baby picture. It says baby picture. She's not a baby, right? And she doesn't want to just not participate because that's not how she's made. So it's really, so we've tried to, you want to draw a picture of yourself when you're a baby? Mom, I don't know what I look like. Like we haven't come up with a solution for that one. But that's a pretty, I didn't realize how common that was, but she's been asked twice already to bring in a baby picture for different activities. And I was like, okay, we got to come up with a solution for this one. So I'm not saying you can't do a cute baby picture activity. I'm just saying you need to be aware that not all kids will have that. So you got to be aware of those kinds of things. Another big, huge barrier to be aware of is the idea of poverty, that a lot of the things that we think of as only costing $1 or $2 are too much. They're too much. They don't have $1 or $2. So that kind of sums it up. I won't give examples. You already know what it's like to be poor because you're here paying for school. So I won't elaborate. But do be aware that what we think of as we are poor is not what we mean when we say poverty. All right. And then the idea of volunteers, the thing I would want you to note for volunteers is that the teacher is responsible to have good communication with the volunteers. If somebody's giving up their time to be helpful to you, you need to have good conversation with them. They need to know what's expected. The worst thing that could happen is some volunteer comes in and says the wrong thing to the wrong kid, and now you got a meltdown on your hands. But the volunteer didn't know because you didn't communicate it with them. You have to have communication. What they're supposed to do, what they can expect, who to leave alone. You know, if you've got a kid who can't handle a negative comment, then in a way that protects the child's privacy, you need to let the volunteer know. Now, our policy is when you're working with groups, I want you to only say encouraging things. If the kids make a mistake, you just make a note of it, and I'll take care of the mistakes. You just praise the good things, right? If there's a kid in there who can't handle it, you don't have to say, this kid can't handle it, right? But you just make it communicated to the volunteer. The other thing in terms of communication with volunteers is make sure that you are grateful for the volunteers that you do have and send thank you notes. I recommend, as a practical thing, that you have some little stashes of the $1 thank you notes in your desk that you can write little thank you notes for things that people do. They're more likely to do more things for you. All right? So that's pretty much what we're going to have for parents. I can tell you that your parent involvement question on the final is going to be a little bit like the one that was on the quiz. I'm going to sort of give you a scenario with a parent. What would you do? How would you solve this problem? It's not going to be some outlandishly specific thing. It's going to be something that if you put on your thinking cap, you can give an answer for. All right, so you probably just want more of an overview. And as I said, the part about paraprofessionals, there's no need for you to review it. All right, if you'll back up to chapter 3. So remember, I promise, after all this talking, you're really going to get to do something. So chapter 3 is the planning, the environment, which is what we're going to be working on in just a little tiny bit. So I'm going to tell you a couple of things. All right, when you go back and look at this chapter for review, you'll notice that a lot of the things it says in this environment mirror what it talked about in behavior guidance about the environment. So those will be very similar things. So you will notice that it talks about the idea that the room arrangement and the materials that you have can affect the children's progress. I'm not going to ask you to arrange a room because we're going to do that today. But here's the one I want you to mark. It's on page 84. Because the rest of them are pretty much examples. On page 84, number 1 says, here's the vital question. Could a stranger who walked into your classroom tell what was valued in this environment? What does that mean to you? That a stranger could come in and look around and see what was valued. How could you accomplish that in your environment?
Hanging up like group projects that the kids did successfully.
Right. So if you have a lot of group projects on display, what does a stranger come in your classroom know this classroom values? Working
Group
together and community, right? Let me start you off. Laura has started off in a positive way. I'll give you a negative example. What if a stranger walks in the room and I see a big long list of 27 rules with underlines and exclamation points? What do I know is valued in this classroom? Teacher control. right? Rules, order, whatever, right? So people get that impression. So now you kind of have a negative and a positive example. What are some others that you can show? Let's say, for example, what if you valued literacy? What would somebody see when they came into your classroom? Jillian?
You have like a nice full classroom library, organized, and seating areas.
Yeah. You would have a lot of books. You'd have a comfortable place for the kids to look at the books. You'd have some way of the kids keeping track of the books, right? That will tell me, ooh, books, they're a big part, right? What if you love science? What if you're like the science go-to classroom? What are you going to have? Eric?
Science equipment like microscopes and stuff like that. Periodic table elements.
Stuff where the kids can touch it and use it, not put away in the cabinet till it's microscope unit time, right? That's kind of what we're talking about. If a stranger walked in your classroom, could they tell what was valued? And what are you saying is valued in the room when you look around? Okay? And then that idea of on one of the pages, let's see, page 88 and 89, it kind of has some suggestions. This whole chapter has a lot, like in your music area, you could have this, in your art area, you could have this. Again, you don't need to memorize those, but if you have a kind of idea, these are the kinds of things that would go in art, these are the kinds of things that would go in music, these are the kinds of things that would go in science, you're good to go. Those are probably questions you could answer without reading the chapter, if you just, again, put your thinking cap on. All right? All right, the next chapter, we're going to go back to our first chapter we read because it was the farthest away, and that's really page 4 through 34, because we didn't read the whole chapter. And then remember, if it was on the quiz, that's something you want to be aware of too. One note for you, if I wrote on your quiz, okay, that means that wasn't the answer I was looking for from the textbook, but, you know, it's okay. You probably want to go like, oh, I better go back to chapter 7 and see what the answer really was. Okay. All right, so on page 4, it talks about developmentally appropriate practice. There's several times in the book that I've asked you to mark that, but I'm going to ask you to mark it again. About 1/3 up from the bottom, it says the term developmentally appropriate practice is in bold, and it means the age and individually appropriate for each child in a program. You're going to want to know that. In case you hadn't gotten the hint already, I want you to know what developmentally appropriate practice is. And then in just a few sentences later, it says, developmentally appropriate practice requires that teachers think about children's basic needs for play and rest. Because you know there's going to be a lot about play. All right? All right, you're going to look on page 6. Remember we talked about the difference between positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment. The big key is that positive reinforcement is the kids get something they wanted for doing what is right. Negative reinforcement does not mean a punishment. Negative reinforcement is you take away something the children do not want as a reward. So they do not want homework. So that maybe means if we all get 100 on the test, we won't have math homework all next week. Right? I'm taking away something they don't want as a reward. That's negative reinforcement. All right, now, you don't have to worry about knowing all these people and who belongs to which theory. That's not going to be on there. But you do need to know about Jean Piaget because you wrote your paper about him, so you know I'm going to ask something about Mr. Piaget so that you can remember him. Right? And you'll want to be familiar with those terms: assimilation, accommodation, equilibrium, and disequilibrium. Because, you know, it's been a while. I don't know. Maybe you stayed up till midnight rereading your Piaget paper every week. I don't know. Because it was such a thing of beauty. But you might want to refresh on Piaget a little bit. Okay? Then you're going to want, on page 10, you're going to want to know about multiple intelligences. Again, I'm not going to ask you to list all 10 of them, but you need to kind of be aware of the idea that there are different kinds of intelligences and what some of them would be. And that's page 10. Again, not necessarily something super specific, but the idea that there are different kinds of intelligences kids have. So that if I said to you, like, here's an activity, tell how you would tailor it to a spatial intelligence kid and a musical intelligence kid. And you could say, oh, we could sing a song, we could do this, something like that. Okay? All right, social learning theory, that's my favorite one. So you want to put a star by that? Because you're going to be here, if you're so fortunate as to have me for language arts next semester, which I can't decide if people are asking which section I am because they want me or they want to avoid me. Don't tell me which one it is. But if you are, you'll be hearing more about Mr. Albert Bandura. Because social learning theory is very important for the teaching of literacy. And that's where kids observe their caretakers performing certain actions and they imitate those actions. And then in the second paragraph of that section, it says social learning theory for teachers is the idea of modeling desired behaviors. You're going to want to know that social learning theory is connected to modeling. Because modeling is very important. Then on page 18, and I think this was on the quiz, I'm pretty sure it was, you're going to want to be aware of the fact that kids' physical development is subfocodulal, so it goes from the head to the feet. And then proximal distal, so it's from the center to the outside. I'm real excited about that one because it has a lot to do with when we expect kids to write with pencils, when we expect kids to sit and do a bunch of paper pencil work. That's why that one's pretty important to me. Okay. Oh my goodness. You want to know about Erickson's stages of psychological development, which is on page 21. You'll want to have a pretty good idea of each one of those. Like, what's an example of trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Remember we did that in class, where we did an example of, in a classroom, this would be an example of shame and doubt. This would be an example of mistrust and trust. You want to kind of refresh yourself on that idea. Okay? And let me just make sure. I think just the idea that we have physical, social, emotional, and intellectual development. Not all the stuff underneath each one, but that they're those basic kinds. Then on page 30, you'll want to know what scaffolding is. And then we're going to turn to chapter 5.
Bless you.
Woo! Chapter 5 is about play. And you know I'm really excited about play, so you can try to focus your attention on this one. You want to know the big idea that's in this chapter several times is that in order for something to be considered play, the player has to choose to participate. Kids need to have the choice. Right? You probably would want to look back at your play observation paper and look at that. You know, we have a little chart of the different kinds of play. Kind of refresh yourself. Again, you don't need to memorize all 12 different kinds, but kind of, if you saw them again, you'd recognize them and be able to give a pretty good idea of what they were. Right? So that's a little bit more concentrated way to find it than trying to weave through the chapter to look for all of the definitions. Right? On page 148, it talks about the purposes of play and how play relates to intellectual development specifically. And at the top of page 149, it talks about how cognitive growth is defined as an increase in the child's basic store of knowledge, which we call that fancy word schema. So you might want to put over to the side a little arrow like I did in my book and say, that's schema. Woo! All right. Because I will probably use the word schema to refer to that idea on the test, and you'll want to know what I'm talking about. You'll want to know about the idea of materials. How we talked, remember we talked about if there aren't very many materials and the kids are fighting over them, you can't have adequate play. Yes, Vanessa?
Which idea were you talking about?
For schema?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, that is page 149. At the very, very top, it says cognitive growth,
Okay.
that sentence. Yeah, I'm going pretty fast, so just wave to me and I'll try to make it more clear if I keep going. Right, you'll want to be aware of the roles of the teacher. That was something that was on your quiz. So what are the different roles the teacher can have in play? Because, again, the reason I'm going to ask about that is because I want you to leave here with the idea that play is not something the kids do while you're grading papers and getting stuff done. Play is a vital part of what they're learning. Okay. And page 158 talks about the benefits of play. And page 160 talks about play as a teaching strategy. And again, it's not necessarily that you go through that whole big section, but just have the overall idea that play is used for teaching concepts, not just for fun. I'm doing a lot of bunny ears today, sorry about that. It's kind of annoying after the play. All right?
Now, did you said something about materials.
Yes.
Now, is that the selecting materials for play, or just you said having an adequate?
Just in general, it references in there having adequate amount of materials and safe materials and the right kind of materials. Again, not something specific, but that you would have an opinion about the materials that will be in your classroom. So maybe along the lines of, if I said, would this be an appropriate material for this situation? It has just a little bit on page 167 about outdoor play, and what you might want to remember about outdoor play is what are the children's needs in outdoor play? Right, it's their large muscle activity that they're using. Again, for this chapter, there's a lot in here. I'm mentioning a lot of things. That doesn't mean there's gonna be a specific question that says, what are the materials that are appropriate? What is likely to happen is that I'm gonna have some questions that are more specific about what are some of the benefits of play, but then I'm gonna have a question kind of like one on the quiz that says, okay, here's what a kid needs, design a play experience for that. And you'll give an example, right? So it's not necessarily gonna be a specific question for each thing I mentioned, but where you're using that information to give an answer. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want you to feel like after the quiz, after the final, you go back and say, there was not a question specifically about this one, and there was not a question specifically about this one. These are things that you're gonna need to formulate your answers that you're creating. And then next is chapter 7, and then we're done with this review. Chapter 7, there we go. And that is record keeping and assessment. It's been a little while since we talked about that. Okay. It's page 202 if you're still looking. The big idea is that assessment is not just testing, and that assessment and testing do not mean the same thing. It's right there under the heading defining assessment and testing. So you'll kind of want to be able to say what's the difference between assessment and testing. The second thing you want to be aware of is on page 203 where it says types of assessment. Again, I'm pretty sure this was on your quiz, formative and summative assessment, and what's the difference. On page 205, the second paragraph talks about reliability and validity. Are something to be considered. And the next paragraph talks about the idea that standardized tests should only be one way that kids are tested and not the only way. That one's pretty important to me for you to be aware of, because whether you teach in Indiana or Kentucky, what you will notice is that the value placed on the standardized test, that is the one-shot deal, is ever increasing. The value to the point where in Indiana, if you're a third grader and you take the iRead and you do not pass it, you do not go on. Even if you have straight A's in reading from first through third grade, it's all based on your score on that test, whether or not you go on. Now, what teachers don't want anything to do with it. What state officials and administrators will tell you is, it doesn't mean the kids return in third grade. They can go on to fourth grade, they just have to keep doing third grade reading work. Well, then they didn't really, they're still being penalized for their score on one test instead of their overall abilities. Before I go down that road, let's just keep going and turn the page. All right, we can skip all that, this section, and we're going to do on page 210, it talks about anecdotal records. I think it's reasonable to assume, since we did a whole big assignment about that, I might have a question about anecdotal records. Like maybe I would give you an example of an anecdotal record and ask you, what did you learn about this child from this observation? Maybe? Come on. That sounds like a great idea. Right? Yeah, I might remember that. Okay. The next one is page 219, portfolios. And again, the thing I like about portfolios, they're a little bit unwieldy to manage, but they are giving you a better picture of the kid. That's the big idea of portfolios, that it's not a one-shot deal, it's an accumulation of a lot of things about the kid, would be the idea that you want to keep in mind about portfolios. Okay,
Which page?
219.
sorry, yeah, 219. And then you'd want to be aware of, on page 225, 226, and 227, it talks about conferences. And it has the little list of things for conferences. Again, I'm not gonna say to you, what are 3 things that you could do for a teacher conference, but I might say, what's something you could do to make a parent conference more successful? And it would be somehow related to one of these. And that's all for that. For your yardsticks chapter, your questions from the yardstick books are going to be the questions from your quiz. I can't make it any more plain. Again, if I put okay by it, go back and reread that section and find out what the text actually says so that you know. Because the yardstick, again, I think it's really good. But the way it's laid out in the chart form, it's kind of hard to come up with a question for using it. So I'm just going to ask the same questions that you already know, because those are the ones that I really want you to take away from the text. Also, I'm expecting that your knowledge from yardsticks is going to inform some of the questions that I'm asking you to answer, because I'm going to be looking for, is your answer developmentally appropriate? So if I say something about an 8-year-old, you would have a different answer than if it was for a 5-year-old. Right? I'm not going to be nitpicky at 6 and 7. Ooh, it's kind of hard to know, right? It's going to be a big range. Like, would this be more appropriate for a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old? Given what you know. And maybe you could give a reason why it's more appropriate for one or the other. That's the kind of question